In the autumn of 1888, terror gripped the streets of London's East End. A killer stalked the fog-shrouded alleyways of Whitechapel, targeting women with a brutality that shocked the world. He was never caught. He was never identified. But his legend would endure for over a century, becoming the most infamous unsolved case in criminal history. This is the story of Jack the Ripper and the murders that changed everything. To understand Jack the Ripper, you must first understand Whitechapel. In 1888, it was one of London's most impoverished districts, a place of desperate poverty, overcrowding, and despair. Families of 8 or more crammed into single rooms. Unemployment was rampant. Disease was everywhere. For the women who lived there, survival often meant walking the streets at night. They were called unfortunates, a Victorian euphemism for prostitutes. These weren't glamorous courtesans serving the wealthy. These were destitute women, often middle-aged, selling their bodies for pennies to afford a bed for the night in a filthy lodging house. Many were alcoholics, all were vulnerable, and in the late summer of 1888, someone began hunting them. August 31st, 1888. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, was 43 years old. She'd been married once, had 5 children, but alcohol had destroyed her life. That night, she couldn't afford her bed at a lodging house. She told a friend she'd soon get her DOS money, slang for the 4 pennies she needed. She walked into Bucks Row, and she never walked out. At 3:40 a.m., a carter named Charles Cross found her body lying in a gateway. Her throat had been cut so deeply she was nearly decapitated. Her abdomen had been slashed open. The murder was recent. Her body was still warm. A police constable arrived minutes later, but the killer had vanished into the labyrinth of Whitechapel streets. The police assumed it was a random act of violence. They were wrong. 8 days later, on September 8th, the killer struck again. Annie Chapman, known as Dark Annie, was 47 years old. Like Polly Nichols, she was destitute, alcoholic, and working the streets to survive. At around 5:30 a.m., she was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. What had been done to her body was far worse than the first murder. Annie Chapman's throat was severed. Her abdomen was torn open. But this time, the killer had taken organs. Her uterus and part of her bladder were removed with what medical experts described as surgical precision. The killer had spent time with the body, working methodically despite the risk of discovery. The message was clear. This was no ordinary murderer. This was someone with anatomical knowledge and growing confidence. Panic swept through Whitechapel. Women refused to go out alone at night. Vigilante groups formed, patrolling the streets with clubs and lanterns. The police received hundreds of letters, some offering theories, others confessing to the crimes. Most were hoaxes. The press sensationalized every detail, and with each article, the killer's infamy grew. But the murders were far from over. September 30th, 1888. This night would become known as the double event. At 1 a.m., a steward named Louis Diemschutz drove his cart into Dutfield's yard and discovered the body of Elizabeth Stride. Her throat was cut, but unlike the previous victims, there were no abdominal mutilations. Investigators believe the killer was interrupted, possibly by Diemschutz's arrival. Frustrated, the Ripper went hunting again. Just 45 minutes later, and 3/4 of a mile away, 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. This time, the killer had the time and privacy he'd been denied with Stride. The mutilations were the most severe yet. Her face was disfigured, her abdomen opened, her left kidney and uterus removed. The savagery suggested rage, but the precision suggested control. The Ripper had claimed 2 victims in a single night. Near Catherine Eddowes' body, police found a piece of her blood-stained apron. The trail led to Goulston Street, where the apron fragment was discovered in a doorway. Above it, written in chalk, was a cryptic message. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner ordered it erased before dawn, fearing it would incite anti-Semitic riots. That decision remains controversial. Was it the Ripper's only written message, or just coincidental graffiti? On September 27th, the Central News Agency received a letter written in red ink. It began "Dear Boss" and was signed Jack the Ripper, the first time that name appeared. The writer mocked the police, promised more murders, and mentioned cutting off a victim's ear. When Catherine Eddowes was found days later with her earlobe partially severed, some believe the letter was genuine. Most modern experts think it was a hoax by a journalist, but the name stuck. Jack the Ripper had his identity, even if no one knew his real one. On October 16th, George Lusk, head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a package. Inside was half of a human kidney, preserved in wine, and a letter written in an uneducated hand. From hell, it began. I send you half the kidney I took from one woman. The writer claimed to have fried and eaten the other half. Medical examinations suggested the kidney could have been Catherine Eddowes, but it was impossible to confirm definitively. Real or hoax? To this day, no one knows. November 9th, 1888. Mary Jane Kelly was different from the other victims. She was only 25 years old, younger and reportedly more attractive. She had her own room in a lodging house at 13 Miller's Court, a rare luxury in Whitechapel. That night, she brought a client back to her room. It would be the last mistake she ever made. At 10:45 a.m., a rent collector peered through the broken window of Kelly's room. What he saw would haunt him forever. Mary Jane Kelly had been butchered beyond recognition. The mutilations were so extensive that identification was only possible through her eyes and ears. The killer had spent hours with her body, taking his time in the privacy of the locked room. Crime scene photographs still exist. They remain too disturbing to show publicly even today. And then, silence. After Mary Jane Kelly, the canonical Ripper murders stopped. There were other killings in Whitechapel. There always were. But none bore the Ripper's distinctive signature. Had he died? Been imprisoned for another crime? Left London? Or simply satisfied some dark compulsion? The sudden cessation of the murders is as mysterious as the murders themselves. The investigation was unprecedented. Scotland Yard assigned its best detectives, including Inspector Frederick Aberline. They interviewed thousands of people, followed hundreds of leads, and employed new techniques like crime scene photography. But Victorian police work was primitive by modern standards. No fingerprint analysis, no DNA testing, no psychological profiling. They were hunting a ghost who left almost no evidence behind. Over the years, dozens of suspects have been proposed. Montague John Druitt was a barrister and school teacher who drowned himself in the Thames in December 1888. His own family believed he might have been the Ripper. The timing of his death coincided with the end of the murders. But there's no concrete evidence linking him to the crimes. Only suspicion and unfortunate timing. Aaron Kosminski was a Polish immigrant and hairdresser who lived in Whitechapel. He suffered from severe mental illness, heard voices, and was eventually committed to an asylum. Police documents suggest he was a strong suspect, and in 2014, DNA evidence from a shawl allegedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes was linked to Kosminski's descendants. However, the chain of custody for the shawl is questionable, and many experts dismiss the evidence as contaminated or mishandled. Perhaps the most sensational theory involves Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria. The royal conspiracy theory claims the murders were orchestrated to cover up a scandal involving the prince. It makes for compelling fiction and has been featured in numerous books and films, but historians have thoroughly debunked it. The prince's whereabouts are well documented, and he was nowhere near London during most of the murders. Still, the theory persists because conspiracy is often more appealing than mundane truth. The list goes on. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor with a hatred of women. George Chapman, a poisoner who later murdered 3 wives. James Maybrick, a cotton merchant whose diary allegedly confessed to the crimes, though most experts consider it a modern forgery. Walter Sickert, the artist whose paintings supposedly contained hidden clues. Over 100 people have been seriously proposed as Jack the Ripper. The truth is, we'll likely never know for certain. The Ripper murders expose the stark divide in Victorian society. Middle and upper-class Londoners were horrified that such brutality could occur in their modern, civilized city. But for many, the real shock was being forced to acknowledge the poverty, desperation, and suffering that existed in Whitechapel. The victims weren't respectable women. They were society's outcasts. Some newspapers blamed the victims themselves. Others called for social reform. The murders became a mirror reflecting Victorian society's darkest contradictions. The press played a crucial role in creating the Ripper legend. Newspapers competed for readers with increasingly sensational headlines and gory details. Illustrations showed dramatic crime scenes, often embellished for effect. The Ripper case was perhaps history's first media-driven serial killer panic. Every crime writer, amateur detective, and attention seeker sent letters and theories to police and newspapers. The signal was drowned out by noise, making the investigation even more difficult. Despite never catching the Ripper, the investigation revolutionized police work. It was one of the first cases to use crime scene photography extensively. Detectives began coordinating across jurisdictions more effectively. The idea of criminal profiling, trying to understand the killer's psychology, took early shape. The Ripper case demonstrated that modern cities needed modern police methods. In failure, it planted the seeds for future success in criminal investigation. Some theorists have proposed that Jack the Ripper might have been female. Jill the Ripper, a midwife or nurse, could have medical knowledge and access to victims without arousing suspicion. Women could move through Whitechapel at night more easily than men might in that context. However, the extreme violence and physical strength required for the murders make most experts skeptical. The theory remains an intriguing outlier in Ripper scholarship. Another theory suggests there wasn't one Ripper, but multiple killers. Perhaps the canonical 5 victims were murdered by different people, with the press and police connecting them erroneously. Copycat killers might have emerged after the first murders received publicity. This would explain why the methodology varied somewhat between victims and why the murders suddenly stopped. However, the consistent targeting of vulnerable women in Whitechapel and the distinctive mutilations suggest a single perpetrator to most experts. Jack the Ripper has become an industry. Hundreds of books offer theories about his identity. Countless films and TV shows dramatize the murders. Whitechapel today hosts Ripper walking tours, showing tourists the murder sites. Museums display artifacts and recreate crime scenes. The killer who terrorized London for 3 months in 1888 has generated over a century of fascination, speculation, and profit. It raises uncomfortable questions about our cultural obsession with violence and mystery. Why does Jack the Ripper still captivate us? Perhaps it's the mystery. Humans hate unsolved puzzles. Perhaps it's the setting. Victorian London provides Gothic atmosphere that feels both historical and timeless. Perhaps it's the victims. Their poverty and vulnerability demand that we remember them, even as the killer's notoriety threatens to overshadow their humanity. Or perhaps it's something darker. Our fascination with evil we can't understand, with violence that defies explanation. It's easy to forget, amid all the theories and speculation, that 5 women died brutally in Whitechapel. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. They were daughters, mothers, sisters. They were human beings whose lives mattered, even though society had largely abandoned them. The Ripper's identity may be history's greatest mystery, but their names deserve to be remembered more than his ever could. In the autumn of 1888, someone walked the streets of Whitechapel and committed murders so shocking they still echo through history. We've given him a name, built a legend, and created countless theories about his identity. But the truth is simpler and more frustrating. We'll never know who Jack the Ripper was. He vanished into the fog and became a ghost, not of a person, but of our eternal questions about evil, violence, and the darkness that can hide in any society. This was the story of the world's most famous unsolved case. The mystery may never die, but neither should our memory of those who did.